Good evening, everyone, and happy St. Patrick's Day. Thanks so much for joining us. It's Evelyn here from the Camera Store. And I want to thank you for tuning in to Landscape Photography, Setting Yourself Apart with Mark Jinks. We're also joined here tonight with Russ from Nikon Canada, and Nikon Canada is sponsoring our event tonight. And let me tell you, there's a lot of other things happening behind the scenes for this live event to make it happen. And hopefully everything will go on without a hitch. And that's thanks to the support of our dream team, the TCSTV live stream team, which includes Drew and Gary from the Camera Store, as well as Riley. And we're all working remotely right now. But these guys are absolute rock stars when it comes to this kind of stuff. And so hopefully everything will go super smoothly. But of course, it being a live event, things could happen. And so we appreciate your patience too. I know I have little kids around the house, so hopefully you don't hear any crazy sounds, but nothing is out of the unexpected. Another exciting thing I want to tell you about is that we love to hear your feedback about these events, and there's a little bit of an incentive for you. So thanks to Nikon Canada and Banff Mountain Film Festival, we have a prize package if you complete our survey after the event, and that's a Banff Mountain Film Festival World Tour Epic Bundle, which gives you a 2-week access pass to a bunch of their films. And normally Nikon and the Camera Store every year go to the Banff Mountain Film Festival. And so if you're the kind of person that loves outdoorsy stuff and adventure, then definitely check it out. They have their World Tour available online, so you can see that all virtually. And basically to enter, all you have to do is fill in our survey, and you will receive a link to that after tonight's event if you registered. And if you didn't register, if you email ryley.smith@thecamerastore.com, we'll put that in the comments. You can email her and she'll hook you up with a survey. So I also want to give you guys all the options for asking questions. And so, of course, you can put them in the YouTube chat window, and you can chat with us. You can ask questions, and we'll do a Q&A at the end. The other option, if you're not logged into YouTube, is you can just email me. So my email is evelyn@thecamerastore.com, and that'll be in the comments too. But that's EVELYN@thecamerastore.com, and you can send me your emails, and I'll be reading them live when we get to the Q&A. But of course, the star of tonight, who we want to hear from, is Mark Jinks, who's now becoming a good friend because we're chatting about all this live streaming stuff. But he is an outdoor photographer with a passion for nature, and his main focus is capturing the beauty of landscapes and wildlife, the energy of severe weather, and the mystery of the night sky. And he currently resides in our sister city up north in Edmonton, and so it's not only the Battle of Alberta tonight in hockey, but we're here right now, Calgary and Edmonton. We're going to battle it out about landscape photography, right, guys?
Right.
Right.
And so yeah, we've been chatting a little bit before we got started, and yeah, we just want to welcome you. And how are things looking in Edmonton right now?
Yeah, it's looking a lot of melting going on.
A lot of smushy brown.
Smushy brown, yeah, yep. Dead brown grass.
Yeah, so what better time to have a landscape photography seminar, because there's not necessarily a lot of beautiful things going on. You don't get a lot of color in that until a couple months down the road, at least in our neck of the woods. Yeah, well, why don't you go ahead and get started, and we'll take this away.
Sounds great. Thank you. So I will just start my presentation here. I'll just take a second or two to load up. Oops. All right. Great. So thank you. So landscape photography and setting yourself apart. So big thanks to the Nikon Canada and the Camera Store for having me along this evening, and thanks to everyone for joining. So I'm just going to go over some techniques that I use in landscape photography to create some unique images, and I hope that there might be a tip in there or two that will help you. So a little bit about me. As Evelyn mentioned, I'm kind of a generalist when it comes to outdoor nature photography. I pretty much love anything found out in nature, whether it's the silence of astrophotography into the stars, to the power of severe weather, to the spectacle of wildlife, and of course landscapes. So I just really enjoy capturing and sharing these moments with others. I'm mostly self-taught. I found the best way that I learned was from others, just hanging out with other photographers and sharing skill sets and information. just being inspired by other photographers, spending a little bit of time, maybe watching some online tutorials each week. I've had a chance to work together with Nikon since early 2018. And I worked with Russ doing a Nikon Canada social event in May of 2019, which is a really fun event. And I've had a chance to have a little bit of my work shared and by some great companies and brands. So I'm proud of some of those accomplishments. All right, so ways to set yourself apart in landscape photography. So I think landscape photography generally has this kind of stereotype of these ultra wide angle scenes, these grand vistas. So I like to mix things up a little bit with different things like different focal lengths and different techniques. So yeah, so I'm going to run through some of those, and I'm hoping there's a tip or two in there that you can take away from this and apply to your photography. Keeping in mind, of course, photography is very personal and expressive and subjective, so it's really up to you how you want to portray a scene. So some of the gear that I use, so I've got both a mirrorless and a DSLR camera. I'm kind of in a switching over to mirrorless. I've been shooting mirrorless for the last couple of years, and I really enjoy it. One of my favorite lenses is the Z20 1.8. I use that for night photography, landscapes, pretty much everything. It's a great all-purpose and light lens. And then one of my other favorite lenses, which I picked up for wildlife, is the 200 to 500 Nikon. I picked it up for wildlife, but it's kind of really grown into a landscape photography lens for me as well. I use it for a lot of telephoto landscapes and things like that.
Cool. And Mark, just wanted to give a shout out that our team put together a page with all of the different links to those products. And so afterwards, we'll post that in the comments and you guys can check it out and we'll email it to you. So you don't have to write it all down right now, but we will share that afterwards.
Thanks. All right, so some accessories that I really like to have with me. So a good set of ND filters or even just standalone ND filters really gives you a chance to control the light a little bit better, especially if you're shooting middle of the day, that kind of thing. Having a nice light but sturdy tripod because you're going to be walking around quite a bit. So having something like that is really beneficial. An L bracket. An L bracket was a real game changer for me. So that allows you to shoot both in portrait and portrait and landscape orientation with ease without having to mess around with your tripod and that kind of thing. And some good lighting sources, especially, obviously for shooting at night, not only for your safety, but for creativity as well. So, a good headlamp, maybe a flashlight, some LED panels, a lume cube, things like that. And always make sure to check your batteries once a year on those kind of things. Or once a year to 6 months, because chances are likely they'll die at the worst possible time. But probably one of my most important pieces of gear in my kit that I use quite a bit is a good set of insulated rubber boots. So I just grabbed some from Canadian Tire. They're great. They're awesome for standing in streams and just going through the snow and that kind of thing, right? So really handy to have. All right, so let's get right into some of the techniques I use here. So first up, telephoto landscapes. So you're looking at Mist Mountain here in Kananaskis, Alberta, Highway 40 heading west from Longview. And it was just a scene that really caught my eye that morning, the way the light was hitting the mountain, the curve of the road, and using a telephoto lens, I shot this at 200 millimeters, I could really kind of compress the scene and kind of really tighten things up a bit and give it just kind of a nice, pleasing look. So with telephoto and super telephotos, you can really access parts of the landscape that you might not be able to otherwise. All right, so telephoto and super telephoto. So this is pretty much the same scene shot with two different focal lengths. So on the left there, it's at 200 millimeters, and then on the right at 500 millimeters. So just shooting that with different focal lengths can really make an impact and make a difference. So this was from the Summer of Smoke. I'm sure a lot of you remember a couple years ago, I think it was summer of 2018, we had all those awful wildfires in BC. And this was just one of the silver linings to get some nice sunsets out of it with that haze in the evenings. All right, so a few more examples here of telephoto landscape photography. So the first one on the left there is Tangle Falls, and I shot this actually I think it was last May or June, just a couple months after the pandemic started. So there wasn't really a whole lot of traffic along the parkway. It gave me a chance to really kind of play around with the scene a little bit, try some different focal lengths, and just try some different viewpoints. And then the middle scene is in Jasper. And I really liked the way that the dark side of the moon and the dark side of the mountain kind of lined up with that scene. So I shot that one at 200 millimeters with my 200-500. And then the far right was at Abraham Lake last year. The water levels were ridiculously high, and you had all these aspen trees just kind of like submerged under the water, and it made for some really interesting shots. So I shot that one at 70 millimeter. And then another thing I really like to do as well is isolate mountain peaks. Just the way that alpenglow hits the peaks, and you can really kind of get a nice tight scene in there just by using your telephoto. And I shot this one at 300 millimeter, and that's one of my favorite focal ranges with my 200-500. It's not always set at 200 to 500 or on each end. I like to shoot kind of in the middle sometimes too.
Hey, Mark, could you talk a little bit about compression and why you would choose to use a longer telephoto lens for something like this?
Absolutely, yeah. So the compression of that telephoto, it just kind of brings everything in closer, and it just kind of tightens up the scene a little bit and kind of adds a little bit of a pleasing effect. That's generally how I like to describe it. All right, so next slide is one I actually just shot this last week while I was out in Jasper. Same thing, just that dark and the light, the way the shadows kind of contrasted with the light, the sun hitting that peak there. Yeah, it was just scenes like this just kind of jump out at me. And then one more here. So this was a beautiful morning. It was a chilly morning, early fall, beginning or late fall, beginning of winter. And these trees just kind of really popped out on this ridge to me. The sun was hitting them nicely. The way the mist was just coming up off of the lake. So rather than shooting that big grand scene, I flipped over to my telephoto and just shot this scene here to kind of isolate little different parts of the landscape like that.
Nice. And we have a question actually from Andrew Sharp, and he's wondering what your favorite prime lens is.
My favorite prime lens right now is absolutely the Z 20 millimeter 1.8. It's, like I said, it's kind of all purpose. I use it for night photography, Milky Way, landscapes, pretty much anything. It's definitely my favorite lens at the moment.
Very cool.
All right, and then in this one, so here's where I isolated the mountain on the far right. So I took that first shot with my wide angle lens. I think I was at 16 millimeters there. And to me, it just seemed a little bit off balance. It was a bit left heavy as far as composition goes with that endless chain ridge on the far left side there. So for me, just jumping over to that mountain and shooting it at 50 millimeters, that just kind of, for me, it made a little bit more sense with this scene. I felt it was a little bit of a stronger feature within that landscape. So, and the way the light was hitting the mountain, and I actually used a long exposure here as well. I found the clouds were a little bit distracting. So by using that long exposure, I think I went about 2 minutes for this one. It just kind of made those clouds a little bit kind of creamy and blurred in the background there. So didn't take as much focus off of the mountain.
And can you just talk a little bit about how you're able to achieve the longer exposure, just in the way of using filters or what kind of methods you use to be able to hit those exposures?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll just kind of gauge what the light is like. So generally around golden hour, sunset, sunrise, I'll use a 6-stop ND filter, just because that's a little bit weaker. And then I'll use a 10-stop, which is a stronger ND filter for kind of more late day, late morning shots. So by applying that piece of glass over your lens and then shooting, you're letting a lot less light in, and you can shoot for much longer and really get that look of. I've actually got a little section coming up on long exposure shortly, and I'll go through a little bit more of that. But it gives you kind of a bit more drama, and it just kind of smooths out rough water and that thing as well. All right, so portrait versus landscape orientation. So you'll notice in this slide that a lot of my images are actually vertical. And I know we kind of tend to think of landscape photography and landscape orientation. It's called that. So, but I think portrait has really kind of become a little bit more popular over the last couple of years, especially with the advent of, the different social media platforms where portrait images tend to show up better on our phones because it's obviously taking up more of our phone real estate on our phones than a landscape image would. So as you're scrolling through apps like Instagram or Facebook, you'll see the portrait images kind of pop out a little bit more. So I don't know if that necessarily, I'm sure it does influence the way some of us kind of shoot sometimes. I mean, yeah, so it's just, especially if I'm shooting a mountain or a waterfall or something like that, I find it just kind of gives the scene a little bit more, you've got more foreground to work with, and it just kind of gives the scene a little bit more of a pop, in my opinion. And I love printing as well when I'm shooting vertical. I love printing those images too.
We have a question actually about shooting vertically, about if you're happy the way that your LCD tilts. This person said the specific thing is, wouldn't you wish cameras have a 3-way tilt LCD screen for low angle portrait orientation shots? So can you talk about using your camera?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so lately I've been using my Z6 quite a bit, and yeah, it's got the live view preview on there. But you're right, if you're trying to get down to the way certain angles and really low on the ground, it does only kind of flip out that one way. So yeah, it's just kind of working around with that a little bit too. And I find using my phone to kind of frame shots before I'm actually shooting them really helps as well.
Cool. And then just to back things up a little bit, we did have a question just asking about what an ND filter is, and it looks like Riley's on it on the comments. But could you just explain a little bit about just what the concept of an ND filter is and how exactly it affects images?
Absolutely, yeah. So an ND filter is generally a dark piece of glass that will reduce the amount of stops of light coming into your camera. So essentially, if you want to shoot something as a longer exposure during the daytime, if you try to shoot a longer exposure during the daytime without having that piece of glass on, your image is going to turn out really overexposed, and in some cases like pure white, just because you've got that much light coming into your camera for that amount of time. So by placing that dark piece of glass over that dark ND filter over your camera, you can really slow down or stop down the amount of light coming in, and that gives you it's a great tool to kind of make those images.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. And thanks to everybody who's been helping with answering that question too. And there is another one asking about if you are shooting RAW, and do you find shooting RAW being worth the extra effort?
Absolutely, yeah. I shoot everything in RAW. With RAW, you've got so much more control over post-processing. Because keep in mind, when you're shooting JPEG, the camera is processing the image for you, right? So if you are shooting in JPEG, it's going to apply, whatever it thinks its own algorithm will think, whether it's more saturation or more contrast or something like that, right? So with RAW, you're basically just taking an image and you're able to do whatever you want with it in post-processing. So absolutely, everything I shoot is in RAW, absolutely.
Cool.
All right, so I will go on to the next slide here, and that actually gets into long exposure. So this scene here, it's a Great Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories, and this was an absolutely cold, miserable, windy day. It was raining on and off, and it was just, I didn't think I was going to come away with any images. It was just a scene that just didn't feel right, wasn't that great for landscape photography. But when you're traveling and you're only in a certain place for short periods of time, you kind of want to make the most of that, right? So in this case, I actually got out the 6-stop ND filter here because it was closer to sunset, and yeah, I managed to come away with a 30-second exposure. So with long exposure in general, you can really smooth out the water, like the waves here, where just kind of rolling across the beach, and by smoothing that out and giving the clouds a little bit of a blurred look with that long exposure, I was able to take kind of a chaotic scene and just kind of transform it into something a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. So yeah, so having a great set of neutral density filters, I think, is just an essential part of a landscape photographer's toolkit.
Cool. And
also
actually,
having
there's, oh, sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say there was one
sure.
person wondering what brand filters you use.
For sure, yeah. So I'm using Nisi filters at the moment, but I wouldn't get too hung up on brand. I did use Lee filters in the past. I've heard really good things about Breakthrough filters. Yeah, there's tons of options out there. So I think the best thing to do is just kind of research. There's lots of information online, and go with
Mark,
that.
Yeah.
I'll say that I've used the Photo Republic filters from the camera store a ton, and I love them.
Yeah.
And they're on the Mark Jinks accessory page.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
So
my little plug for something that's not Nikon, they're fantastic filters. So.
thanks, Russ.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
and I'll say this, that we don't actually carry the exact brand that Mark shoots with, but there's lots of different brands available. So what we did list was kind of our house brand. And these ones are excellent for beginners. They're kind of a more affordable filter set, but they do the trick. And so those are in the link that's in the description. So if you click that, you can check out some different options that'll get you on your way to using different filters. And it is such a great tool to really enhance your landscape photography overall, as Mark was saying.
Absolutely. All right, so I'll get into an example now of a regular exposure versus a long exposure, so you can kind of see the difference. So the image on the left I shot just without an ND filter at all, just kind of regular settings, f11. It was a 1 second exposure in that light. And then when I put my 10-stop ND filter on, I was able to go for 90 seconds. So you can really kind of see the difference of that effect of adding that filter on. The clouds kind of have that streaky look. And yeah, so by using these ND filters, you can really kind of play around and get some really creative scenes. So here's 3 examples of different time frames. So different times of day makes a huge difference. So the far left image there of Ram Falls, that was just a 30-second shot at sunrise with a 6-stop ND filter. The middle shot there of Medicine Lake, so that was kind of more middle of the day. I think it was early afternoon, so 90-second exposure with a 10-stop. And then that final image there, it was kind of late afternoon, and I was able to get a 300-second exposure, so almost 5 minutes out of that. The water was really choppy. You couldn't see any reflection at all. So by adding that filter on there, you were able to bring out a little bit of a reflection, just kind of almost that time, that 5 minutes developed a reflection there. Okay, and then one more scene here, just along the Athabasca River in Jasper National Park. So there were all these ice chunks coming down the river, and I just wanted to kind of capture the motion in those. So I just used a simple 10-second exposure here with a 6-stop ND. And yeah, I just really like the way this scene turned out. The light was hitting the mountains there. This was a fantastic morning. I'll actually get into something a little bit later called image yield, where I'm trying to get the most amount of images and kind of like the shortest amount of time during a sunset, but this was one of those. And then these are my, what I call short long exposures. I know that's kind of an oxymoron, but these are typically waterfall scenes where I want to have that silky water look, but at the same time, I want to retain a lot of texture in the water. So generally these kind of scenes, I won't use an ND filter, but I'll maybe just use a polarizer or maybe even just a graduated ND filter, which is half dark and half light. And just for like anywhere from 1 second to 1/20th of a second. So the three examples I've got there, on the far left, it's an 1/8 of a second, and then a 1/2 second for the one in the middle, and then 1/10 of a second. I find 1/10 of a second is generally my go-to, and then I kind of work forwards or backwards from that, depending on the look I want to achieve. Okay, so next up we've got panoramas. So panoramic scenes. So these are multiple images taken and then stitched together in post-processing, like Lightroom or Photoshop. So in this case, there was this awesome storm. I love chasing storms in the summer, so this beautiful rainbow appeared after the storm. But even with my widest lens, which I think was a 16mm at the time, I couldn't even fit that whole rainbow in there. So instead of that, I shot a vertical panorama. So 7 photos for this one vertically, and then I stitched them together in post-production. And then another one here. So this one was actually 11 images. This one was probably my most challenging pano to shoot, just because the northern lights are constantly moving. So I had to be really fast. They were really quick exposures. I think each one was about a 1/2 second. But yeah, the northern lights were just amazing on this night. This was up in near Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. And it was one of those nights where the northern lights were everywhere. They were pretty much 360 degree in the sky. They were to the south, to every other direction. So I really wanted to try and capture as much of that as I could. So in this case, I used 11 photos and got like pretty much a 180 degree view here. So as a general rule of thumb, when you are doing panoramas, to have enough data for it to read the data properly and get a decent panorama, you generally want to overlap about 30% for daytime scenes and about 50% for nighttime scenes. So one more pano here. Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, maybe you're going to get to this. Someone is just wondering how you actually stitch the images together. So maybe you'll get into what process you use. And just a little side note, I know there's been a bunch more questions about filters, and we are going to have a Q&A period at the end. So I will circle back to previous questions that we missed.
For sure.
But I'm just going to try to keep the questions coming in kind of on topic. So yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, sounds good. So for panoramas, so I just use the merge tool in Lightroom generally, and it automatically stitches everything for you. So you want to select, once you've imported into Lightroom, you want to select all of your images. So in this case, for this one, it was a 9 image shot. So I selected all 9 of those images, and then I believe it's merge panorama in Lightroom, I believe, yeah, off the top of my head. And it basically does everything for you. And once that's done, it'll kind of crop it to cut off all the excess. And from there, you can kind of play around and make it your own image with your regular processing workflow. So yeah, so this scene here, so there was a Chinook arch. I know we get those quite a bit in southern Alberta, and it was just the way it lined up with the road. I know it's not exact, but it was just a beautiful scene that I wanted to try and capture as much as I could. That just kind of arching over the fields and just kind of a summery type image. All right, so intimate landscape. So these are some of my favorite to shoot lately. Again, it's not all about the grand landscape. Just finding little bits and pieces within the landscape can tell a bit more of a story, especially if you use those images together with your big landscape shots. So yeah, just looking for different textures, patterns, and details. You just want to kind of tell that different story. So I really liked this image here with all these animal tracks going towards this tree, and it's got a little bit of a mystery behind it. Yeah, so just looking for little smaller scenes to add more of a storytelling component to the overall story.
With this one, Mark, can you tell us where you are? Like, are you standing on something above it? Are you on a hill? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, so I'm pretty much actually, for this one, I'm just on the side of the road. I think this was along the Moline Parkway, the Moline Road in Jasper, I believe. So there's so much cool stuff out there. I was just out there a couple of weeks ago with my friend Shane, and we just took one day and just kind of went up the Moline Road, I think it's called, and just look for little things along the way, little pieces of the landscape, and yeah, it's just a lot of fun to shoot that. So yeah, so here's some more patterns. This was out on Abraham Lake. I know Abraham Lake always kind of gets the bubbles, kind of get all of the focus there, but there's so much more there, from ice shells to different patterns in the ice. And then, yeah, this one really jumped out at me. It was just these 4 triangles kind of intersecting. So there's lots of these little patterns like that if you kind of walk around a bit and look hard enough for them. And then, yeah, here's another one of those scenes from last week. It was just these little snow pillows, I call them, boulders covered in snow, and it's just a really simple scene, but just adding to the overall story of that entire day. Yeah, and it's just shooting something different, right? So it's easy to kind of want to be drawn to these big landscapes, but just shooting these little intimate scenes as well, kind of really kind of rounds out your skill set and adds a little bit of variety.
Mhm.
So this one here, so this is just some trees, and this is it's just an abstract scene. It's called intentional camera movement. So this is where you actually want to do a long exposure on purpose. Just in this case, I think I used my telephoto lens here, and to achieve this effect, I just essentially just panned down. I wanted to get away with the longest exposure I could. So at the settings that I use, I think I really made my aperture really small, so probably around f22 or f25. And then that gave me enough to get away with, I think it was a fifth of a second exposure, just at my base ISO, and just panning the camera down. I was able to achieve this effect. So lots of fun to play around with those kind of things as well, different little abstracts. And then here's a few more. So I really like kind of putting these together in different color phases and different different times of year. So you got the fall colors from that leaves, just those leaves just kind of floating in a puddle of water, and then just little intricate ice patterns along creek beds, and then the burned out forest there from the forest fire, and that, to me, that kind of resembled like these porcupine quills or something like that. So yeah, just really fun to shoot these little scenes. And then these 3 images are from Jasper Lake, which is kind of overflow from the Athabasca River. And if anyone is familiar with that lake, it doesn't really get a whole lot of water in there. So it's usually like an inch or 2 of water. And when that freezes up, you get these really cool sand patterns underneath the ice. So just walking along the ice and just looking for little patterns and shapes and like little bubbles like that. Yeah, just one of my favorite places to look for those little details. All right, and then for this one here, so this was a beautiful morning. It was a frosty day. I love going out on those frosty days. The light was just really cool hitting those frosted trees here. So I just isolated again and again on this part of the landscape. The rest of the landscape was great, of course, but just finding these little details, just the way the light hit and the frost, and yeah, just looking for little things like that. So here's another icy, frosty scene. Looking up out of a gap into the blue sky window there. So this was at Natural Bridge. So there's a window of about 3 weeks in January or February where you can actually go down underneath the bridge. Obviously be careful, but yeah, you can actually get in there and shoot some really neat scenes within these kind of like makeshift ice caves that have all this erosion in there from all of the water.
Lots of nice comments, Mark, on the frosted tree photo and a lot of these here, and we have lots of questions pouring in too for the end. So
Oh, wonderful.
don't worry,
Thank you.
guys. We will get to your questions and comments a little bit later.
Absolutely. All right. So using foregrounds and other elements, they add depth and scale to your images. So it kind of gives you kind of a nice leading line, leads your eye into the scene, it adds to the story that you're trying to tell. So yeah, I really like kind of incorporating foregrounds in a lot of my images. There will be some times where I don't like incorporating foregrounds, and I'll get to that in a little bit as well. But I'll show some examples of different different foreground elements that you can use in your images over the next few slides. All right, so here's 3 scenes with foreground elements, leading lines. So you get the leading lines from the road there, leading into that autumn scene, and then you've got the flowers and the meadow that kind of lead into the mountain, and even something as simple as footsteps. You can make your own, or maybe look for animal tracks or something like that, right? So it kind of adds a little bit more interest to a scene. For that sunset there, and that was I think that was in Prince Albert National Park, Saskatchewan. Yeah, just trying to look for little things that you can incorporate in your images. At the same time, you don't want to add too much foreground and too much elements to your photos, because then things get a little bit distracting and you don't know where to look in the image. So yeah, so keeping it simple, but at the same time adding some leading lines or foreground elements. So here's a few more. So I really like lone trees that you can see in fields. I really like focusing on those, but in this case, I added that. I looked for that boulder and added that into the foreground of my image as well, just to give it a little bit more depth, a little bit more interest. And then another one from Abraham Lake. I was talking about like the ice shelves and that kind of thing. So to get that kind of bluish effect, I had a lume cube and I stuck that just kind of in that little snowbank there, and it kind of lit up that ice to add a little bit more interest in the foreground. And then the third image on the far right, so that's out at Blatchford Lake Lodge in Northwest Territories, and I just found this lichen kind of with these fall colors all over the rocks there, and just using that as a foreground, right? Like, you wouldn't necessarily always think of that. Just yeah, look under your feet and find things there. And then using water as a leading line, it comes back a little bit to, I didn't obviously stand in all of these rivers here, but it comes back a little bit to having that set of rubber boots where you can kind of go out and stand in some of these streams and look for different angles. So yeah, so there's 3 scenes here. Even using a waterfall is kind of a leading line if you have something else in the background, like a mountain in this case. Yeah, so having those rubber boots comes in handy. So yeah, so foreground versus no foreground. So I like these shots just as much. They're 2 different shots because, one, I included all those driftwood logs in the foreground, which kind of adds a little bit to that whole rugged north feel. And then for the other one, I really also like the way the aurora was kind of mimicking the shoreline, the curved shoreline. So yeah, I excluded the logs from that one. Yeah, so just, it's up to you whether you want to use foreground or not. You can play around and sometimes use it, sometimes not, or do both. Yeah, so it's all about experimentation. So here's a few more scenes where I didn't want foreground. I found foreground might have been a little bit too distracting here, and I just wanted to go for just a nice symmetrical scene in these shots. Obviously the reflections, and just, yeah, so just kind of keeping things the reflections balanced and keeping it simple. And feel free to go ahead and break some traditional photography rules, like the rule of thirds, like center compositions, center heavy compositions. I actually really love myself personally. So just using those to kind of tell your story. All right, so focus stacking. So focus stacking is a technique to get your entire scene in focus. So in this case, my lens was really close to those tulips, like maybe half a foot in front of the tulips. So because of that, the tulips are in focus, but the mountains weren't in focus in the background. So I wanted to get all of the scene in focus. So I took 4 shots, changing my focus point at different intervals throughout the shot. So maybe as you can see there, on the far left, the tulips are in focus. And then to the far right, the mountains are in focus. So I just changed my focal length going through. And then that way you can take those 4 images and you can stack or blend those in Photoshop or Lightroom or what have you, to come away with a final image. And by doing that, you also get a lot more data, because you are using a lot more information from your camera, by stacking those shots. So yeah, and a lot of the new cameras, like the Z6, for example, it has built-in focus stacking. So yeah, it's called focus shifting, I believe. So yeah, it takes a lot of the manual work out of focus stacking now. So here's the final result of that image after I put my processing spin on it. So yeah, so all that data was able to give me a little bit better control. You can see the crescent moon now. You can see a little bit more detail in the sky, a little bit more color. Everything is in focus how our eyes would naturally see it. Yeah, so.
Where is this, Mark? This is so beautiful.
Yeah, so this is actually at the Chilliwack Tulip Festival. So there's a couple of tulip festivals in BC. There's one in Abbotsford and one in Chilliwack, I believe. So yeah, just for me, I've been kind of inspired by seeing all the tulip fields in Holland. And I just thought it was so cool that here we have kind of mountains behind the tulip fields as well. So, and Washington State, I believe, has some really great tulip festivals as well. So I was really fortunate to get in here right at sunrise before the crowds came. And that gave me a chance to really kind of walk around and explore different compositions. All right, so close to home landscapes. So obviously, we're in a pandemic right now. Travel isn't very feasible, especially going abroad or across country. So finding scenes close to home that you want to shoot, really kind of sharpen your skills before you do go on those long travel trips. So anytime you're traveling, you're investing, you're not only money but time, right? So and it's time you can't get back. So by sharpening those skills and shooting a lot of landscapes close to home, that way you can really kind of, when you do get to those locations, you've got a little bit more experience. I'll go back to a little story. I went to Iceland in, I think it was 2015. And I felt pretty rushed. For one, I tried to do the whole country in 10 days, and that just wasn't that great. But also my skills weren't quite where I wanted them to be yet. I had just actually picked up some ND filters about a month or two before I went, and that was probably a little bit of a mistake because I couldn't really have enough time to kind of become comfortable with those filters. So by shooting close to home and kind of using the tools we have, we can, when we do go on those trips, we're a little bit more prepared. We always tend to think of the grass is greener on the other side. Here in Alberta, it's, let's get to the mountains. The mountains are, get a lot of attention, but the reality is you can make a lot of great images right close to home, right in your neighborhood. And this next slide, these 3 images here, I photographed, within a half hour of my house, pretty much. So again, going out on those frosty mornings, and I'll get into a little bit about that after. Just trying to understand weather a little bit better has really helped me with photography. And then a nice little blue hour minimalistic scene from Elk Island National Park. And then that 3rd image there, that was actually shot in just kind of a roadside slough, like a little pond. There's a lot more meltwater. So this time of year, obviously, we've got a lot of meltwater with all that snow runoff. So getting out there, just finding a reflection in a field or something like that. If you can kind of plan for a nice sunset, you can really get out there and make some nice images and just places you would normally just drive right past. So apps and planning. So yeah, I try to use as much planning as I can with my photography. So while it's not 100% accurate, as the Aurora Chasers in Edmonton this past weekend will tell you, it was supposed to be clear skies, but we ended up with a lot of clouds. So it's not always accurate, but I find that using these apps to kind of help predict cloud cover, um, dark skies, um, things like that, it just really helps. It gives you a better chance to succeed. And then, yeah, again, your phone is a valuable tool, so you can use it scouting. My Google Maps has like pretty much thousands of pins on it, just from places I've saved locations to that I want to come back and shoot. So I can revisit those and get to them right in the dark or something like that without having to look around. So yeah, using Google Maps is a really valuable tool to save some of your favorite locations. All right, so I'll go through a couple of the apps that I really like. So Astrospheric is a great one. It's a free app. It generally predicts cloud cover. So by using this app, I can kind of look for spots on the map that line up with sunset and sunrise that might have about 30 to 50% cloud cover, which usually yields some really nice light. If you can kind of find that balance of that cloud cover. And then for night photography as well, like if I want to find, a place with clear sky, like I said, it's not always accurate, but it's better than nothing. And just trying to find places that are free of cloud at night. And then another thing I look for on Astrospheric is the dew point. So trying to predict hoarfrost or rye mice a little bit in the winter, right? So I find December is a great time of year for hoarfrost, and just looking at the dew point. If the dew point, I think, I'm not a meteorologist or anything, but I think if the dew point's a little bit lower than the surface temperature, there's a good chance of frost developing if you have clear skies at night. So that's generally the kind of thing I look for. And another great thing about the Astrospheric app, not only with it being free, but it also includes the KP index for Aurora, which will give you the general sense of how strong the Aurora would be. So TPE, the photographer's FRMS, shows you the sunset and sunrise paths. So there'll actually be lines on the map of where the sun will rise, and at different times of day, you can kind of follow it around. So it's great for planning shoots. It's a really easy app to learn. It's got all the moon phases in there. It's got all the different stages of twilight. So if you want like full darkness for Milky Way shots, it'll kind of give you an idea of when it's going to be fully dark. And there's also a light pollution map built in there too. So if you want to really get out of the city to shoot Aurora or Milky Way, or just stars in general, it'll give you an overlay of the map of where the best dark places are. All right, and then PhotoPills, it's very similar to TPE. It's a little bit more advanced, and to be honest, I probably don't even use 80% of it. It's a bit way too advanced for me, but I like using it it's a great resource for planning Milky Way shots. As you can see in that screenshot there, it'll tell you exactly when the Milky Way is going to be up in the sky, and then that kind of white line over there is kind of the direction the Milky Way will be in. So yeah, there's tons of things in this app as well. Like there's a long exposure calculator for when you're doing your ND shots with a little timer and countdown. Hyperfocal distance. So that would be it'll kind of give you an idea of how close or how far away from a scene to get everything in focus. So yeah, so this app might be a little bit too advanced for some people. But it's a great alternative to TPE, and I find they kind of mesh well together as well. So a few more apps that I like. For predicting Aurora, Space Weather Live is my go-to. It kind of gives you all of the data in one look. And then for storms and weather in the summer, like I said, I absolutely love getting out and chasing some storms. I use an app called Radar Scope, which is a really detailed radar app. Windy is another good app that's a great alternate for cloud cover, and I'll sometimes use that with Astrospheric just to kind of confirm what the cloud models are going to do. And then, of course, yeah, like I said before, Google Maps, great for pinning locations, returning to shoots. If you're trying to find like an abandoned barn in the middle of the night, it's going to be pretty difficult if you don't have a pin in your map to go to. All right, and then yeah, so using severe weather in your landscape photography too. So yeah, if you take some time to learn a little bit about the weather, learn some different clouds and how things kind of react with the environment, you don't really need to be a meteorologist or anything, but just some simple skills that will give you a chance to identify when potential severe weather occasion or severe weather will occur. That'll give you some nice dramatic images as well.
Hey, Mark, when you're
Mhm.
going after severe weather, have you ever been in a position where you were worried that the severe weather was going to creep up too close, or like have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you're in danger?
Maybe when I first started out, I think one of the big things I focus on for weather is safety. So
Mhm.
I try not to get too close to the storms, and I'll actually encourage people to use your telephoto to shoot into a storm as well, right? So if you get too close to the storm, you're not going to get any shots regardless, because that storm's going to be on top of you and all you're going to see is rain. So you want to kind of keep your distance. Most storms do go from a southeast to northeast, or a southwest to a northeast direction. So if you can kind of hang on the edge of that and just kind of, take some roads and just kind of map out your roads ahead of time. The last thing you want to do, and if you're out with severe weather, is get stuck in a dead end somewhere. Be very careful around things like rivers where there's not a lot of roads, not a lot of bridges crossing. So for the most part, I've gotten away with being pretty safe, because the last thing you want is your vehicle just completely dented with hail or something like that, right? So
Yes.
yeah, so just, you want to get some nice images, but I find if you get too close, you're going to be right in the precipitation anyway, and it just isn't worth it. All right, so I touched on this a little bit earlier, image yield. So there's times where I just like to really slow down my photography, like when I was up on the Moline Road last week. That was just no rush, just really slow. But then there's times where I might be traveling in a location for only one sunrise or one sunset, and I want to come away with the most images I can during that time. So yeah, so I came up with this little thing called image yield, and it's coming away with useful images in the shortest amount of time possible, just by moving around and changing your position, right? So these three images were shot pretty much an hour apart, a half hour each. And yeah, so the first image there, the sun was setting, and I had the sun positioned behind me where I could pick up that nice soft golden light, illuminating those trees. And then the middle image, I went right to where the sun was setting itself and just captured that sunburst as it was setting over the horizon. And then that third image was just the sun, the light was just kind of lingering around. So just, yeah, like pretty much all 5 minutes apart of each other with these images here. So yeah, I think it's just important to not, I know we're all guilty sometimes of just kind of anchoring ourselves in one position throughout an entire golden hour, just waiting for that light to change and be perfect. But I think if you just kind of, you know, just go with it and just kind of move around with the light, even just changing your direction, like looking left or looking right, you could end up with something really great. So yeah, image yield. And then I've got another slide here, which same thing. So this was a morning just this past October in Jasper, and I went along the Athabasca River, and I just kind of walked up and down the river looking for different scenes. And then same thing here, like these three images were essentially like about a half an hour apart. So I was really happy coming away with those images. And then this is where the planning came in as well, right? So I knew there wasn't really going to be much for clouds. So I positioned myself with the sun behind me in this case, just so I could get that nice kind of alpenglow on the mountains and the peaks, and look for little things like that. And then I actually ended up with, like I said, probably about 8 images, but these are 5. So in that same sunrise, like I went up to Athabasca Falls after I'd finished shooting along the river. And then, another 45 minutes later, I came away with these two images as well. So since I knew that there was no cloud cover that morning, I figured the sun might do something really cool with that kind of mist plume that we touched on earlier coming up off the falls. So the light just kind of broke through those trees there, and it only lasted for about 30 seconds. So just being in the right place at the right time, just through looking at those apps and planning a little bit, right? So yeah, this morning I was really happy, even though it was like a cloudless sunrise, pretty much. I came away with like, 5, 6, 7, 8 images that I was really happy with. All right, so the icons, the popular locations. So with these, obviously, it's really easy access to get to, but the compositions aren't very original. They're icons for a reason. So for these, I try to go to these if I don't really have a whole lot of time in an area, and I know that they're pretty solid, and they'll generally come through with a nice shot. Or if there's unique weather conditions. So this shot here of Two Jack Lake, there was a Chinook arch passing above, and it was a really warm day. I think it was in January, and yeah, just with all that kind of pooling water there, I was able to get a little bit of a reflection, and the clouds from the Chinook arch lighting up at sunset. So yeah, so for these kind of iconic locations, you're going to see tons of inspiration on social media for these places. And it's great to shoot these, obviously, if you're visiting a place for the first time as well, right? So yeah, so I don't stay away from the icons at all, but I just try to find some unique conditions for them. And then here's another one in Canmore. The Three Sisters generally always get the star of the show, but just looking to the right or left. So I just moved 10 feet to the left, and I was able to get this nice images of all these kind of trees reflecting in the water there. Yeah, and there's 3 more really popular locations here. So Emerald Lake, Vermilion Lakes, and Moraine Lake. So for the Emerald Lake shot, I actually shot all of these like 5 years ago in 2016. But as the blue hour was just starting at Emerald Lake, the lights were just starting to come on to the Cilantro restaurant there, and I found this kind of old rotting log to use as a foreground with Mount Burgess, adding some nice contrast in the back there. And then Vermilion Lakes, I'm sure a lot of people on the call here are familiar with Vermilion Lakes. There's usually always some great images to be made there. I opted to use a long exposure here. There was some beautiful light just coming off from behind the mountains, and there was just enough of a little gap there in the cloud to send some light beams into the air. And then Moraine Lake. So, you've probably seen thousands of shots of Moraine Lake. So in this case, I went there just right after a snowfall, just before the road closed for the season, and I was able to come away with a kind of a bit of a different shot with the snow in the foreground, and just kind of a nice magenta sunrise. So yeah, so it's just a matter of looking for unique conditions at these iconic places to kind of give you something a little bit different. All right, and then as I mentioned in my kit earlier, I like having a few light sources. So some low-level LED lighting, maybe a lume cube or two, and it kind of adds a little bit more depth to your night images if you can kind of light up the foreground a little bit softly. Yeah, and it just kind of enhances the whole scene here. You can if you don't have anything like that, you can use your headlamp or your flashlight to kind of light paint. I find that those can be a little bit harsh, so I do like to use those kind of lower level lighting. They're just kind of a really ambient, soft light. And then here's another scene, Milky Way. There's that brown dead grass we were talking about this time of year. This is a great time of year for the Milky Way, by the way. So I was out shooting this with another photographer friend, and we both had some LED light panels. So to kind of balance the scene out a bit, we each set up a light panel on each side of us. So the whole scene was kind of being lit up. Yeah, and it kind of just added a little bit more rather than that abandoned house just being kind of a silhouette. it just kind of added a little bit more of a dimension to the image. And then, yeah, this Northern Lights over this old car here. So granted, I did have a lot of moonlight on this evening, but I did use, I think this was several years ago, 2017, I think. And I didn't have any light panels at that time. So I just used a flashlight to kind of just lightly paint the car a little bit, just for maybe a second or two on this shot, which was probably at least about 10 seconds. So yeah, so using moonlight, but also using external lighting as well to kind of add a little bit to these scenes. And then the Drumheller hoodoos. So also use some external lighting here as well. So for this one, I believe I used a light panel, and it just kind of adds a little bit more to those hoodoos. Like, again, they're not in silhouette. You can see all those layers of rock throughout the hoodoos. It just kind of adds a little bit more uniqueness to the image. All right, so post-processing. So that's another way to kind of put your own unique spin on your photography. So some of the software programs that I use, Lightroom and Photoshop, I really like the Topaz denoise. If I have really high ISO images, using that really kind of takes a lot of that noise out and still retains the sharpness of the image. And then I really like the Nik collection as well, mostly the Color Effects Pro, sometimes the Silver Effects for some black and white stuff. For me, I don't really use any kind of presets. I just do all my own editing from scratch for each image. I just think that there's just so much variety that for me, presets weren't my thing. And just my own personal ethics, I don't have any problem with it, but I don't use any kind of sky swaps or anything like that. I just kind of prefer to keep everything representing reality as much as I can. But yeah, that's just my personal ethics. And speaking of ethics and characters, so some things to keep in mind while you are out in the landscape. So obviously, leave no trace. If you happen to break an ND filter, clean up all the broken glass. It's so frustrating to find that in some locations. And be aware of the weather conditions. It's easy to get caught up in a storm, especially if you're in a place like the mountains where the weather is constantly changing. Tell others where you're going if you're going out shooting alone. Be respectful of other photographers, non-photographers, hikers. Like, everyone's out to share the same space. So, you know, if lots of people are walking through your shot, it's not really fair to get frustrated with them, because they're there to enjoy the landscape as well. So in that situation, I would probably say, you know, you're better off to go to an area with a lot less people. And then one final thing, just watch your light at night. It's just a matter of trying to keep your night photography etiquette in check. Just, you know, if other photographers are around you shooting and your headlamp's going crazy all over the place, then that's obviously going to affect their images. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, and yeah, so private property, always get permission. Don't trespass onto private property, especially, you know, for night shots or something like that. You know, there's a lot of rural crime going on right now, so landowners really don't appreciate if you're out, you know, going to their barn in the middle of the night. That's going to raise a lot of suspicions. So most landowners that I've talked to are really fine with you using their property. If you want to shoot like an old abandoned building on there or something like that, you know, I'll usually give them a print or something like that as kind of a trade. So yeah, just being respectful of that kind of thing. And then on social media, be active and friendly. Even if you get criticism, it helps you become better in the long run. And yeah, so what I do is I develop a code of ethics that I have on my website, and it just kind of holds me accountable, whether I'm out by myself or doing a workshop or just out with other photographers. Yeah, just something to kind of keep myself accountable. And then one of the final things I'll say is just never stop learning. Don't become complacent. Just try and soak up as much knowledge as you can with photography. and yeah, just continue to evolve. And then sorting my work into collections and series over time is something I really enjoy lately too. Is you kind of, you get into like a decade of shooting, you can kind of see places change in different conditions at the same area, same locations, and that kind of thing, and it kind of adds to kind of a neat way to kind of build your portfolio. And yeah, and that's it. And we'll open things up for a Q&A right now. If you're
Yeah.
looking for my social links, they're right there. I'm pretty much at Mark Jinks Photo on everything, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And there's my website right there. So
Woohoo. Well, thanks, Mark. And first of all, we appreciate you sharing all of your information. And I think it's really helpful just to get some of they're not really secrets, but just hearing some of your advice. And I know we have a ton of questions to get to.
absolutely, yeah,
So I'll
for
do my
sure.
best to give them to you. Give them all to you, but we'll see how we do. So the first one I have here is from someone named David, and he's wondering, one challenge in landscape photography is changing lenses. How do you balance between telephoto and normal lenses and wide lenses? He finds that carrying those lenses and changing them is a hassle. He personally decides on shooting in advance, but what do you do?
Yeah, so for me, I generally have two camera bodies on the go most of the time. So I will just generally marry my telephoto to one of my bodies and then keep a wider angle on that other one. If I do need to change in the field, I'll try to do it somewhere like out of the elements, right? So maybe in my vehicle, just so you're not getting too much dust in there, because believe me, I get so much dust spots on my sensors that, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that, but I get a ton of dust spots just from changing lenses like that. So I try to keep that to a minimum. But that's a great point about kind of thinking ahead of time. So if I'm out maybe looking for wildlife or something, I'm going to have my 200-500 on one of my bodies pretty much right on my passenger seat. And then I might have a wide angle lens there too, just in case I do see something that kind of pops up. But for me, when I'm doing landscape photography, it's a little bit more slow and deliberate. So in that case, I've got a tripod set up and that kind of thing, right? So, but yeah, that's a really good point too. It is kind of a pain. Sometimes I feel like I need like 6 camera bodies just to shoot everything I want. But yeah.
Totally. And the tech guys are saying you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and
Oh,
then that we
great.
can be nice
Okay.
and big in the in the view.
Absolutely. Yeah,
And
for
while you
sure.
do that, the next question is from Dan,
Mhm.
and he's just wondering how you determine exposure. So he's heard of things like exposure to the right without clipping the highlights. Others
Mhm.
said exposure 1/3, 2/3 of a stop underexposed, as if the transparency or slide film is being used. And so just any comments you have on that would be
For sure.
appreciated.
So I'm constantly checking my histogram. The histogram is just such an amazing tool to kind of keep you in check of where you want your exposure to be. So I know on a lot of the newer bodies, you can have like a kind of a live histogram on your live view screen. I know on my Z6 it has that. So that information is right there, and just kind of take some test shots if you need to, and then just kind of back off or go the other way. And one thing I will say is the LCD screens that come on the back of our cameras generally are set to the brightest setting right out of the factory. So I try to bump that down a little bit so it's not artificially give me a false sense of the brightness of the image, right? So I'll put that at about halfway, about 50% for that
Save you some
brightness.
battery life too.
That
Which
too,
is always
absolutely.
nice. There's a couple of questions in the YouTube comments. One was from Barry, and he wants to know: do you have a go-to ISO for long exposures?
For long exposure, I try to keep my ISO at the base as much as possible. So generally around 100 is generally the standard I will go with. There might be a couple situations where I might need to go a little bit higher, but it's pretty rare. So generally as low as you can go, because the longer you shoot, the more noise you're going to introduce, and then you're going to get something called hot pixels, which are a pain to remove. So yeah, I try to keep the ISO at the base as much as possible.
Okay. And then there was a couple of questions about metering, how you're metering for long exposures. Do you guess the time and do trial and error? And then also, how do you focus when you're doing and doing your metering for long
For sure.
exposures?
Yeah. So for focus, I'll always focus ahead of time and then switch over to manual focus before I put my ND filter on. That way your focus is kind of locked in and you don't have to worry about it searching with that dark glass on there. And then for metering, I generally always shoot in, I believe it's called matrix or evaluative metering.
Mhm.
The only times I'll really go away from that is if I'm shooting something where I need some kind of spotter or center metering, like the moon or something like that. So yeah, so generally always, I think it's called matrix metering, I'm pretty sure. And that takes the whole scene into consideration.
Okay. And then there was a question from Nola about how you store all your photos, considering that you're shooting in RAW, you're using a pretty high resolution camera.
Mhm.
So how are you archiving everything?
Yeah, so I use multiple external hard drives. So generally, the hard drives I use are about 5 TB. So I'll use my Lightroom catalog on my external hard drive, and then I'll just kind of back that up to the other hard drive. So just by using those external hard drives, I'm not digging into the space available on my computer, right? So yeah, and at that point, it really becomes a non-issue. And then it's just a matter of, after a shoot, I'll try and go through and cull as many images as I can, just to kind of cut down how much I'm saving as well.
Do you use any cloud storage at all, or is it all actually
I
like
do,
solid state
yeah.
drives?
Yeah, so, the only thing with an external hard drive, unless you keep one off-site and keep it constantly updated, if God forbid you have a fire or something like that, you're going to lose everything. So I also use a cloud storage called Backblaze. I really like that one. It's just automatic. You don't need to set anything. Once you plug in your external hard drive or your computer, it automatically starts to back up everything. And I believe with that one, in the event that you do run into an issue, they will actually send you out a hard drive with all your data on it. And
Oh,
it's part of your service, yeah. So, and I believe you just have to send the hard drive back or keep it at a cost or something like that. But
I might
yeah,
have to
so
look
that's
into
really,
that. That sounds awesome.
mhm, yeah, really handy. Fortunately, I've never had to use it, but it's a good kind of insurance policy. And I think it's only like $60 a year or something like that. So it's not too
Nice.
bad.
Nice. Not sponsored. We're just
Right,
hearing the
exactly. Yeah,
details.
yeah.
Um, and there's another question wondering what your opinion is about fisheye lenses for
Mhm.
panos and auroras. I'm thinking from the point of view of the 10.5 f2.8 lens.
Right. So I haven't used fisheye lenses a lot. One of my good photographer friends uses fisheye lenses, and I think you can get some really good, really cool images in there. Especially some of those like almost like 360 looking um, images that really have those kind of, yeah, you can really see a lot of detail, right? So I think fisheye lenses are really cool, and you can really do some neat things with those for sure.
They'll be trickier to stitch for sure for a panel,
Mm.
but you won't need to as much because you have such a huge field of view.
Because then
Yeah.
you
Right. Yeah.
We have a question from Brian Mary, and shout out to Brian Mary. He's part of the local Bow Valley community, and he's an instructor as well, doing all kinds of photo tours. And he said, "Nice presentation. What is your favorite hard to get place for photography, and what minimal gear do you carry in the backcountry to get to where you go?" He said backpacks can sometimes get heavy. It's totally
Absolutely,
true.
yeah, absolutely. Geez, favorite place to get to. Wow, that's a tough one. There was probably just trying to think of places around here, but yeah, regardless, going out into the backcountry, I definitely wouldn't bring my telephoto, just because it is, pretty much a 10 pound or 5 or 10 pound lens. So if I want to do something really quick, and be able to move really quick and not bring a lot of gear, I will probably just bring like my mirrorless with the 20 mm. I might bring the 24 to 70 because it's not a lot of weight as well. And then just having a good tripod to use that with too, right? And I might bring maybe one ND filter or something like that, just in case I run into that situation where I want to use it. But yeah, I'll have to get back to you, Brian, on trying to figure out one of my favorite places to get to in the backcountry.
So, do you find that to get to a lot of these places, you're having to hike for long distances, and like how skilled of a hiker do you have to be to sometimes get to these places?
Not much at all. A lot of my places, honestly, are pretty road accessible. So yeah, I'm definitely no mountain climber or anything like that myself. So I think just a lot of scenes can be made just along the roadside, right? Or even just a short, like 5 kilometer hike or something like that. You can really come away with some good images too.
That's great. Susan wants to know, do you have any suggestions for getting a sunburst in a sunset photo when the sun is just above the horizon?
Absolutely, yeah. So for something like that, you want to set a really small aperture. So something like f16, f22. Keep your ISO at 100 or your base ISO, and then probably f8, f11 for your aperture.
No, sorry, you mixed yourself up, Mark.
Or yeah, sorry. Probably you want it to be as fast as possible for shutter speed. And it generally depends on the kind of lens that you use too, right? So the more blades that you have in the lens, the better the starburst effect.
Yeah, and that nice small aperture you said right off the top, Mark.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I meant.
I knew what you meant, Mark. Don't worry.
Yeah.
There's another question about filters. I know we talked a lot about that earlier, but Kimberly was wondering if there's any advantages with circular polarizer filters versus the ND filters that you talked a lot about.
Absolutely, yeah. So with circular filters, the screw-on filters, they're going to take up a lot less room in your camera bag. So that's a really big plus right there. I do like having one screw-on filter myself, just for those little situations where I'm hiking a bit. But yeah, I mean, the drop-in ones, you're going to have a lot more selection, a lot more play. The good thing about the drop-in ones is if you do have to reset your focus, you don't have to take it all off again and unscrew it. It's just a matter of sliding it off or pulling it to the side. So there's pros and cons to both for sure. The circular ones also, they're going to be a lot cheaper as well. And yeah, definitely don't take up so much room for sure.
Here's a funny question, and I'm kind of curious about this too.
Yep.
So when you're traveling with others, and maybe you do, maybe you don't, how do you keep their patience and their expectations when you're taking forever to shoot the perfect landscape photo?
Right.
We're just going to do a quick little stop over here, but then that turns into like the most epic light. So how do you keep them calm?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think if you kind of set expectations ahead of time and talk about that ahead of time, it results in a lot less animosity, I guess you could say, about trying to leave at a certain time or anything like that. So I think if you talk that through ahead of time with other photographers, even do a plan. Like when I went out last week with my friend Shane, we had this plan to go to these locations by this time, and then meet up and go to Moline Canyon at that time. So I think it's just a matter of just talking it out ahead of time, and just preparing for that, and also being flexible too. Like you said, if the light does go crazy where you are, obviously you don't want to spend that time traveling because you're right there with good light. So you don't want to kind of waste that time as well.
Okay. And then for yourself, do you mostly do your landscape photography alone? And when you are you listening to music? Are you listening to a podcast? Like, how do you keep yourself kind of busy while you're sometimes waiting for those longer exposures?
For sure. So yeah, I generally I just love the sounds of nature. So for me, when I'm listening to music or podcasts, it's generally just in my vehicle. When I am waiting for longer exposures, I would probably scout a little bit more, right? It depends on the exposure. Most, if they're 30 seconds to a minute, they go probably pretty fast. But you did see a couple examples where I was getting to like 5-minute exposures. So at that time, I would kind of maybe go for a little walk and just look around the corner and see if anything else was there worth shooting and that kind of thing. So I'd maybe plan my next stop and look at what the clouds are doing. Just kind of see how the light is changing too, right?
And here's a good question. When you're coming back home from a landscape shoot, are you filling up cards with tons of photos, or do you get to a spot and you're just kind of clicking away like half a dozen? Like how much are you going home with to work through?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that's kind of evolves over time. I think as you get more confident in your ability to shoot, your images become less, and you kind of have a plan of what you want to shoot and what you kind of have a picture in your head of what you want it to look like. And I think, you know, when I was first doing landscape photography, I would take all kinds of shots, generally of the same scene as the light changed, like I mentioned before. But now it's kind of, I'm not going to say that, you know, I get one shot at each location and move on and I'm happy with it. That's definitely not the case. But I think over time, you kind of shoot a little bit less and you're maybe a little bit more picky about the light and what you're shooting, right? So, yeah.
Okay. A few questions about light painting.
Mhm.
So this one here from Rod said, when you're light painting with a 10-second exposure and you're only hitting the object for a couple of seconds, do you paint the beginning, middle, or the end of the shot?
It generally doesn't really matter. I would generally just do it right at the beginning. Once I've hit the release, I have my flashlight or whatever ready to go. And I would just do it right then and there, get it over with. But I don't think it really matters because that 10 seconds is just capturing that data, no matter what you're doing during that time, right? So I don't think that really does matter, beginning or end. Yeah, so.
Okay. For your images that were in the image yield examples, how many shots did you make before you're happy, and how much post-processing did you do to reveal your vision? Or were you happy with those captures at that time?
Yeah, so I mean, it was a bit of both. It was kind of some spray and pray kind of methods of just trying different, you know, different scenes along the river. You know, kind of framing things up with my phone ahead of time. And yeah, just a matter of yeah, just up and down exploring. And I probably took that morning, maybe I took about 30 to 40 images. So, and then coming away with like, you know, 6, 7 or 8 or whatever it was that I was really happy with. So that was some pretty good yield there. And sorry, what was the second part of that question again? I missed that.
Let me go back to it. Oh, yeah. So how much post-processing did you have to do to be able to achieve your
Right.
vision?
Absolutely. So not really a lot, just my basic workflow of just bringing down the highlights a little bit, bringing up the shadows a little bit. I might have gone into Color Effects Pro a little bit and played around with a couple things in there, but really not a whole lot. It was just, I mean, that morning was such a beautiful morning with the light hitting those peaks, and I mean, it didn't really take much post-processing I didn't really want to change that too much, right? So yeah, so the way the alpenglow, you know, paints the mountainsides already for you, it's just a beautiful thing.
Okay. And we're just coming to the end of this now. So I know there's some other questions to get to, and maybe we'll get to a couple more after that. But I was just curious to know for you, how did mirrorless change your landscape photography? Has it enabled you to do anything different that you couldn't before?
I think it's a little bit more intuitive. So it takes a little bit of the guesswork. Just seeing that live view preview all the time rather than switching the live view on and off. Like it generally gives you a smart image preview before you even take a shot, right? So that's a great factor if you're kind of pressed for time, or you know, you're shooting a lot of things on the fly. So yeah, and the lightweight factor, right? So I think my mirrorless camera weighs probably, I'm not going to say half as much as my DSLR, but probably, you know, 2/3. So just having that extra weight, you know, kind of gives me a chance to kind of move around a bit more and not worry about having to haul too much gear with me.
Fantastic. And because we're in Alberta, there was a few questions asking for your expertise on how do you prepare and dress for the weather. I know you talked about your
Mhm.
woods boots, but do you have any other tips on how to
For
stay
sure.
warm and keep those batteries and your camera
Hmm.
in good shape?
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. So definitely look at the forecast ahead of time. Like if you know it's going to be -20, -30, then you're going to want to layer up with a lot of thermal, a lot of merino wool, things like that. So always be prepared. Like even in the middle of summer, I'll keep like, some cold weather gear in my car, like maybe a good set of, some Tucan gloves and maybe some like rain gear or something like that, or some thermals or something like that, right? Just to, because you never really know, right? And I mean, you could end up stranded somewhere, right? So,
Definitely.
yeah, just being safe and that kind of thing, and just yeah, really kind of focusing on the weather, and it's all about layering, and yeah, staying safe.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Mark, and thanks, Russ and Nikon Canada for making this event happen. Of course, we want to know what you guys think about this, and so we have our feedback survey available, and you guys can enter that for your chance to win from Nikon as well as the Bath Mountain Film Festival a special access pass. So make sure you fill in our survey by Friday, and if you did not register and don't receive a copy of that survey, just email ryley.smith at thecamerastore.com, and her email address is in the description below. So thanks again, everyone, for joining, and we'll sign off until next time. So thanks, Mark.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for having me.